So the title of the presentation is, Can we organize courage? Now, courage is a virtue, and virtues pertain to the character of an individual. Now, the Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote that one can develop courage and one can develop virtues, and the way to do that is through practice. You need to act, you need to practice a virtue in order to develop it and find the right measure. So obviously, if you can practice it, then surely we must be able to organize it, or to set up this kind of practice within organizations. So the question, can we organize courage, is actually a question, can we design some organizational procedures that either entice the virtue of courage or that could compensate for a lack of virtue, a lack of courage. Let me just... Now, this is based on the presentation here is based on work in progress that I'm doing with Susan Langenberg. It builds on an earlier publication, and we've had this paper up on SSRN for quite a while now. And so in the next issue of Electronic Journal, Business Ethics and Organization Studies, that paper is going to be featured there. What that paper is that paper is pretty much a philosophical, conceptual paper building on Foucault's notion of parrhesia. And we show that parrhesia implies courage. And there is what we've developed from that is that courage is not only required from the speaker, but also from the hearer. And so what I'm presenting today kind of builds on that. I'll be briefly explaining the idea of parrhesia and the link to courage and why we need it for the paper we're currently developing. But basically, the idea of it is, the background of this is that whenever disasters and failures happen in organizations, it turns out that there's not a lack of knowledge about it. People knew things were going wrong, or people suspected that there is malpractice going on, or there are mistakes being made. So it's not a lack of knowledge, but a lack of courage for sending bad news up in the hierarchy of the organization. Now, this has been studied before within organizational literature, and it's known as the mum effect. People know about mistakes, people know about things going wrong or risks, but the mum effect denotes that quite often they don't speak up. Another stream talks about the deaf effect, how even when people speak up, even when people raise concerns, those who are supposed to pick it up remain deaf. They don't hear it, or it's been wiped off the table. And you've got a lot of that, both mum effect and deaf effect, in the literature on escalation of commitment. And that whole escalation literature is where we're trying to bring our philosophical work and the conceptual work into, to get it more, well, to get closer to finding an answer to our question, can we organize courage? And to further explain where this is coming from and where we want to take it, and I'm starting here now at the bottom of this slide. So we've done previous work on this notion of parrhesia. Parrhesia is a Greek word. It means frankly speaking truth. And this is something that the philosopher Michel Foucault wrote about in his the last part of his life. And he emphasized that parrhesia, frankly speaking truth, implies a courage. It implies courage from the person who's supposed to speak. It implies courage because frankly speaking truth entails a number of risks for the speaker. And he briefly mentions that it's not just courage to speak, but it's also courage to hear what is being said. So it also takes courage to hear when someone speaks the truth. what we've developed in that previous paper is that we've put it in an organizational context, and because you've got in organizations, you've got hierarchies. So the implication of courage to speak and courage to hear becomes much more explicit there. So what you get is you get a chain of speaker-hearer courage, where someone on the work floor would frankly speak the truth to their line manager, who requires courage to hear it, but then that speaker needs to turn into a speaker himself in order to pass it on. So you get speaker-hearer, who then becomes a speaker, and there's another hearer who then becomes a speaker and another hearer, in order for the malpractice or the mistakes or the risks being investigated, looked into, and corrected if necessary. Maybe it's useful to say a bit more about what exactly this frankly speaking truth means. Foucault traces it back to the notion of critique. Now, for the main part of his life and the main part of Foucault's work is on the power-knowledge bond. And this power-knowledge bond, so the way you derive power from what you measure, what you know, makes it possible for you to exert power. Right? So there is a strong connection between those who have knowledge, those who have power, and those who have power dictate what kind of knowledge will be sourced. And this is expressed in organization in just ways of structuring, ways of organizing, and the organizational discourse of the terms being used, what's being measured, how do you measure performance, how do you measure risk, etc. Now, paresia, this frankly speaking truth, exposes the power-knowledge bond. So it is truth that is being spoken in, if you want, a different language. It is truth being spoken in categories that are not included in that official organizational discourse. So it's pretty much fundamental critique because it breaks the organizational discourse. And that's why it's risky, and that's why it requires courage. It is basically saying, or it's basically just saying, no, not like this, without providing any alternative. So paresia is courageous speaking, just exposing something as, we don't want it like this, or this is not how it should be, but you've got no better alternative there. And this takes courage, right? It takes courage because if there would be an alternative, you would be speaking critique within a certain discourse. If you speak critique in a language that the organization understands, you remain within the same power-knowledge bond. But paresia, the courageous speaking, just exposes that power-knowledge bond, so breaks out of that organizational disclosure. It takes courage because there's always attempts to reduce that fundamental critique to the organizational discourse. When someone raises these concerns, these critiques, they are required to give reasons, to give arguments, or sometimes the person speaking the critique is being questioned. Right? Who are you to say this? So only people in certain positions are allowed to say certain things. Right? So there's notions of authority coming into that as well. We're also using Weick and Weick's work on sense-making in organizations. Fundamental to Weick's work on sense-making is that he sees sense-making as retroactive, which basically means first you act, and when you've acted, we then use existing meaning, existing building blocks of making sense, to give meaning to make sense of what we've done. So it's very weird. So for Weick, it's not that our meanings would give us reasons to act, but it's more like, well, things happen, we act, and immediately we make sense of it. We rationalize them using the meaning we previously had. So this is an example of how is an example of the tendency to reduce fundamental critique to what we already know. Sometimes this is not possible, or if internal critique has been denied or one has remained deaf to that critique, then sometimes disasters happen and it's out in the open, and then there's no way in which you can use the existing meaning to save the situation. We've got an example here with the BBC currently in the UK where, well, it's out in the open now. The existing story of the organization no longer works. And what you get is a rupture in sense-making, a rupture in the story. You get a whole, or the risk is high that you'll end up in a disorganization. And what it then takes is to reorganize, to recreate a story. There are plenty of examples out there, and I'm not going to name any unless you ask me for it. But corruption scandals are good examples of companies that get into a rupture and a disorganization follows, and they need to reinvent the story of their company. So, to sum up, in organizations there are hierarchies, so you need a chain of speaker, hearer, who then becomes the speaker, and both require courage. So it requires courage to speak, it also requires courage to hear. And our research has mainly been on the functioning of internal whistleblowing policies. So policies through which people are invited to raise their concern within an organization. And we see these, or actually we're finding out to what extent these internal whistleblowing policies can be seen as an example of trying to organize courage. We're trying to find out to what extent would that be possible. We started working on this notion, can you organize it? Because, well, Susan and I differed of opinion on that. I was of the opinion that things like ethics and virtues like courage, we have to be able to organize it. Right? There's some, maybe it's wishful thinking, but I held to believe that it must be possible, that there must be a way. The only thing it needs is for us to find that way. Whereas Susan comes from a different angle, and she would say, well, ethics, it's really down to personality. It's not how you organize it. You can try it, but it really comes down to personality. So we're trying to find out if internal whistleblowing policies are an example of trying to organize courage. To what extent does it work? To what extent can you organize it? And what we're doing now is we're trying to fit that into the de-escalation literature. And there's a lot of it out there. And a lot of it talks on escalation of IT projects. And escalation happens when you've got an IT project and it's been budgeted for a certain amount of money and it's been planned for a certain time. So it needs to be finished by a certain time. But these projects tend to go over time and over budget. And what quite often happens is that good money is thrown after bad money. And one keeps doing that. Although, it's clear that the project is not a success, one keeps throwing money and time at it. So that's escalation. So there's a whole stream of literature on de-escalation. How do you prevent this escalation from happening? What does it take to stop projects that are not going well? And I've listed a number of publications there, and the PAN publication from 2004 is actually a literature review showing what different triggers and conditions are there that provide ways for de-escalation.